Barren Empty Promises. Mercy Hollister had spent a decade trying to forget Jesse Boone, the outlaw who left her behind. But when he rode back into town dust-covered, dangerous, and staring at her like she was still as she knew the past had finally caught up, he smirked, tipping his hat. "Still pretendin' you don't miss me, darlin'?" he murmured. "'Cause I sure as hell missed you." Chapter 1. A decade of dust and regret. The wind, a relentless, rasping thing, whipped through the skeletal branches of the cottonwood trees lining the dusty main street of Redemption, Arizona. It carried with it the scent of sun-baked earth, the distant tang of sage, and the ever-present ghost of wood smoke, a smell that always tugged at something deep inside Mercy Hollister. 10 years. 10 years since the scent of wood smoke had mingled with the coppery tang of blood and the acrid bite of gunpowder, a night that had etched itself onto her soul like a brand. Mercy watched the wind stir the dust devils, their swirling forms mimicking the turmoil that still churned within her, even after all this time. She stood on the weathered porch of the Hollister General Store, the same porch she'd stood on as a girl, dreaming of a life beyond the confines of this small, unforgiving town. The dreams had faded, replaced by the gritty reality of running the store, caring for her aging father, and bearing the memories of a love that had burned as bright and brief as a desert sunset. The general store was her life now. Its familiar smells, the musty scent of burlap sacks filled with coffee beans, the sharp tang of vinegar, the sweet aroma of horehound candy were a comfort, a shield against the memories that threatened to surface whenever the wind howled a particular way, or a stranger rode into town with eyes the color of a stormy sky. Her father, Silas Hollister, emerged from the dim interior of the store, his shoulders stooped with age and the weight of years spent wrestling a living from this harsh land. He leaned heavily on his cane, the wood worn smooth by countless hours of restless pacing. His eyes, once sharp and full of the fire of a frontiersman, were now clouded with a weariness that mirrored the landscape itself. "Another dust storm brewin', Mercy," he said, his voice raspy, a sound like dry leaves skittering across the parched earth. He squinted at the horizon, where the sky was turning a bruised, angry purple. "Gonna be a bad one." "I'll secure the shutters, Pa," Mercy replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the inner tremor his words had caused. Storms always brought back the memories, amplified them, made them feel as raw and immediate as if they'd happened yesterday. She moved with a practiced efficiency, her movements economical and graceful despite the heavy denim skirt and sturdy boots she wore. Years of hard work had given her a quiet strength, a resilience that belied the delicate bone structure of her face and the haunted look in her deep-set, hazel eyes. Her hair, the color of sun-bleached wheat, was pulled back in a severe braid, a few stray strands escaping to frame a face that had seen too much, felt too much, for a woman of only 8 and 20. As she secured the last shutter, a lone rider appeared at the edge of town, a silhouette against the swirling dust. Mercy paused, her hand tightening on the wooden latch. There was something familiar about the way the rider sat his horse, a casual arrogance that sent a shiver of unease down her spine. She told herself it was just the storm, the way it played tricks on the eyes, conjured phantoms from the dust. The rider drew closer, the sound of his horse's hooves muffled by the wind. He was a tall figure, lean and hard, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He wore a duster, the color of dried blood, that billowed around him like the wings of a predatory bird. A rifle was slung across his back, and a pair of revolvers were strapped low on his hips. Mercy's heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the growing roar of the wind. She felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach, a premonition that had been lurking in the shadows of her mind for a decade. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, who the rider was. He reined in his horse in front of the store, the animal a magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming despite the dust. The rider dismounted with a fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. He looked up at her, and the years melted away, leaving her standing face to face with the ghost of her past. Jesse Boone. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, were just as she remembered them, intense, piercing, capable of seeing straight through to her soul. They held a hint of amusement, a flicker of something darker, something dangerous, that made her breath catch in her throat. His face was leaner, harder, etched with the lines of a life lived on the edge. A thin scar bisected his left eyebrow, a new addition to the familiar landscape of his features. He smirked, a slow, deliberate curl of his lips that sent a wave of conflicting emotions crashing over her: anger, fear, and a treacherous flicker of something she'd tried to bury for 10 long years. He tipped his hat, the gesture a mockery of politeness. "Still pretendin' you don't miss me, darlin'?" he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that resonated deep within her, stirring up memories she had fought so hard to suppress. The wind seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the frantic beating of her heart. "'Cause I sure as hell missed you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations, with the weight of a past that had never truly been laid to rest. The dust swirled around them, a physical manifestation of the chaos he had brought back into her carefully constructed life. She wanted to scream, to run, to erase the last 10 years and return to the naive girl she had been before he had ridden out of her life, leaving her with nothing but a shattered heart and a legacy of pain. But she stood her ground, her back straight, her chin lifted in defiance. The wind whipped at her skirt, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering on the dusty porch. The storm had arrived, and with it, the reckoning. She could feel it, a cold premonition settling over her. Chapter 2. The Outlaw's Return. The rain, a sudden, torrential downpour, plastered Mercy's hair to her forehead and soaked through her clothes in seconds. It was as if the heavens themselves were weeping, mirroring the turmoil that raged within her. Jesse Boone stood before her, unyielding as a granite outcrop, the rain seemingly having no effect on his stoic demeanor. He was a storm in human form, and she was caught in its eye. "What do you want, Jesse?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. She clasped them tightly together, hiding their trembling from his sharp gaze. He stepped closer, invading the small space of the porch, the scent of leather, gunpowder, and rain clinging to him like a second skin. It was a scent she had once found intoxicating, a scent that had haunted her dreams for years. Now, it filled her with a suffocating sense of dread. "Want?" He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Is that any way to greet an old friend, Mercy?" "You were never my friend, Jesse," she retorted, her voice laced with bitterness. "You were a thief. You stole my heart, and then you rode away without a backward glance." His eyes narrowed, the amusement fading, replaced by a flicker of something that might have been regret. "Things were complicated, back then." "Complicated?" she echoed, a surge of anger coursing through her. "You left me to face the consequences of your actions. You left me to pick up the pieces of a life you shattered." He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, but he didn't touch her. The gesture, however hesitant, sent a jolt of electricity through her, a reminder of the undeniable connection that had once existed between them. "I never meant to hurt you, Mercy," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper against the roar of the rain. "I had to leave. It was the only way." "The only way for you," she corrected, her voice sharp. "You never considered what it would do to me, to my family." Her father, hearing the raised voices, shuffled to the doorway, his hand resting on the shotgun he kept leaning against the frame. His eyes, though clouded with age, were narrowed with suspicion as he took in the scene before him. "Mercy? Who is this?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "This is Jesse Boone, Pa," Mercy said, her voice tight. "Remember? The man who rode off with the devil 10 years ago." Silas's grip tightened on the shotgun. "Boone," he growled, the name a curse on his lips. "Get off my property." Jesse slowly turned his gaze to Silas, his eyes cold and assessing. He didn't seem intimidated by the shotgun or by the old man's hostility. "I'm not here to cause trouble, old man," Jesse said, his voice devoid of any warmth. I just came to see Mercy. She doesn't want to see you, Silas retorted, his voice shaking with anger. You've caused her enough pain. Jesse's gaze returned to Mercy, his eyes searching hers. Is that true, darling? Do you really want me to go? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was a challenge, a test, a plea all wrapped into one. Mercy felt torn, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, resentment, and a lingering spark of something she couldn't deny. She wanted to tell him to go, to send him back into the storm from whence he came. But the words wouldn't come. She looked at his face, at the lines of hardship etched around his eyes and mouth, at the scar that bisected his eyebrow, a testament to a life lived on the edge. She saw a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the boy she had once loved, buried beneath layers of cynicism and regret. She began, her voice faltering. She couldn't lie, not to him, not to herself. I don't know. The admission hung between them, a fragile thread connecting them across the chasm of years and betrayal. Jesse took a step closer, his hand still hovering near her face. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the storm beginning to pass. I need your help, Mercy, he said, his voice low and urgent. It's a matter of life and death. Her heart skipped a beat. Despite everything, despite the pain he had caused her, she couldn't ignore the desperation in his voice. She knew, in that moment, that she was going to help him, no matter the cost. The past, it seemed, was not finished with her yet. A decision needed to be made, and Mercy knew, deep down, the well-being of those around her were at risk. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. The air inside the general store was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the dripping of water from their clothes and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. Silas had reluctantly lowered his shotgun, but his eyes remained fixed on Jesse, his distrust palpable. Mercy had lit a kerosene lamp, its warm glow casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the shelves stocked with goods and the faces of the three people caught in this unexpected reunion. Help you with what? Mercy asked, her voice cautious. She moved behind the counter, putting a physical barrier between herself and Jesse. It was a small gesture, but it helped her feel a little more in control. Jesse leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were alert, constantly scanning the room. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, choosing each one with precision. There's a dangerous man who's after me, he began, his voice low. He believes I have something that belongs to him. And do you? Mercy asked, her gaze unwavering. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. It's complicated. It always is with you, Jesse, she said, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. He sighed, running a hand through his wet hair. His name is Silas Thorne. He's the leader of the Thorne Gang, the most ruthless bunch of outlaws in the territory. The name sent a chill down Mercy's spine. The Thorne Gang was legendary, their reputation for violence and brutality preceding them like a dark cloud. She had heard stories of their raids, of the towns they had terrorized, the lives they had destroyed. What does he want from you? Silas asked, his voice gruff. He had moved closer to Mercy, his presence a silent offer of protection. He thinks I stole something from him, Jesse said. Something valuable. He met the old man's gaze. A map. A map. To what? Mercy pressed, her curiosity piqued despite her apprehension. The scent of the lamp's oil brought forth another memory of Jesse. To a lost gold mine, Jesse said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The legendary Lost Dutchman's Mine. Silas scoffed. That's just a legend, Boone. A fairy tale to lure fools to their deaths. Maybe, Jesse conceded. But Thorne believes it's real. And he's willing to kill anyone who gets in his way. Mercy felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. She knew the allure of gold, the way it could corrupt even the most honest of men. She had seen it happen in redemption, seen friendships shattered and lives ruined by the feverish pursuit of riches. Why come to me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why bring this danger to my doorstep? He looked at her, his eyes softening. Because you're the only one I can trust, Mercy. You're the only one who knows. He paused, his voice trailing off. Knows what? She pressed, her heart pounding. He hesitated, then reached inside his duster and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it, revealing a folded piece of paper. It was old and brittle, the edges frayed, the ink faded. This, he said, holding it out to her. This is the map. Or, at least, a part of it. Mercy took the map gingerly, her fingers trembling. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a series of intricate lines and symbols, a cryptic language that spoke of hidden riches and forgotten trails. As she studied the map, she realized that she recognized some of the landmarks, some of the symbols. They were familiar, like echoes from a dream. I've seen this before, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and confusion. But where? Jesse leaned closer, his breath warm on her ear. Your father, he used to tell you stories, didn't he? Stories about the old days, about the prospectors and the outlaws, about the lost mines and the hidden treasures. Mercy nodded slowly, her mind racing. She remembered the stories, the tales her father had told her when she was a child, stories she had dismissed as mere folklore. But now, looking at the map, she realized that there might have been more truth to them than she had ever imagined. The symbols, Jesse whispered. They're a code. A code your father knew. Silas, who had been listening intently, let out a sharp breath. I don't know what you're talking about, Boone. Jesse's eyes narrowed. I think you do, old man. I think you know exactly what this map means. And I think you know where the rest of it is. Silas remained silent, his face a mask of defiance. But Mercy saw a flicker of fear in his eyes, a subtle tremor in his hands. She knew, in that moment, that Jesse was right. Her father was hiding something connected to the map, to the lost mine, and to the dangerous man who was hunting Jesse. The shadows of the past had returned, and they were deeper and darker than she had ever imagined. The danger was very real. Chapter 4. The Unspoken Bond. A tense silence filled the store, the only sound the gentle hiss of the kerosene lamp and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The clock, a relic from Mercy's mother's family, had always been a source of comfort, its steady rhythm a reminder of the passage of time, of the enduring strength of family. But tonight, its ticking seemed to amplify the tension, each tick a countdown to an unknown danger. Mercy looked from Jesse to her father, her mind reeling. She had always known her father to be a man of secrets, a man who carried the weight of the past on his shoulders. But she had never imagined that his secrets were so dangerous, so intertwined with the world of outlaws and lost treasures. Pa, she said softly, her voice pleading. Tell me what's going on. Please. Silas avoided her gaze, his eyes fixed on the floor. He ran a hand over his weathered face, his expression a mixture of regret and resignation. He looked older than his years, the lines of his face etched deeper by the weight of his unspoken burden. It's a long story, Mercy, he said, his voice hoarse. We have time, Jesse said, his voice firm. Thorn won't be here tonight. The storm will slow him down, but he'll be here soon enough. Silas finally looked up, his eyes meeting Mercy's. There was a sadness in them, a depth of pain that she had never seen before. It started a long time ago, he began, his voice slow and deliberate. Before you were born. I was younger then, more foolish. I rode with a different crowd, men who lived by their own rules, men who weren't afraid to take what they wanted. Mercy felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that her father had a past, a life before he had settled down in redemption. But she had never imagined that he had been an outlaw. I rode with Jesse's father, Silas continued, his gaze shifting to Jesse. We were like brothers, closer than blood. We chased dreams of gold, of freedom, of a life beyond the constraints of the law. Jesse nodded, his expression unreadable. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, listening intently. We found the map, Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Or at least a part of it. It was hidden in an old abandoned mine, tucked away in a secret compartment. We knew it was something special, something valuable. But we didn't know exactly what it meant. And then, Mercy prompted, her voice barely audible. And then everything fell apart, Silas said, his voice filled with regret. There was a disagreement, a betrayal, a fight over the map. Jesse's father, he was killed. Mercy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Jesse, her eyes filled with sympathy. He met her gaze, his expression stoic, but she saw a flicker of pain in his eyes, a brief glimpse of the grief he had carried for so long. Thorn killed him, Jesse said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He wanted the map for himself. He believed it would lead him to the lost Dutchman's mine. I tried to stop him, Silas said, his voice shaking. But I was too late. I managed to escape with a piece of the map, the piece Jesse has now. I hid the rest of it, somewhere safe. Somewhere Thorn would never find it. Where, Pa? Mercy asked, her voice urgent. Where did you hide it? Silas hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if he were afraid of being overheard. It's hidden in a place that only I know, he said, his voice low. A place connected to your mother. Mercy felt a surge of emotion. Her mother had died when she was a child, leaving a void in her life that had never been filled. She had always felt a deep connection to her mother, a sense of longing for a woman she had barely known. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and sadness. It's hidden in her music box, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its resonant tones filling the silence. The unspoken bond between father and daughter, between past and present, had been revealed. And with it, a dangerous path forward had been laid bare. It was time for all of them to face the demons that had been set upon them, and for the future they all desperately sought. A future which was, for this night at least, entirely up in the air. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Wind. Mercy's breath caught in her throat. Her mother's music box. A delicate, intricately carved wooden box that had sat on her dresser for as long as she could remember. It was a treasured possession, a tangible link to the mother she had lost too soon. She had often opened it as a child, listening to the tinkling melody it played, imagining her mother humming along to the tune. She had never imagined that it held a secret, a key to a dangerous past. The music box? She whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. But how? Silas gestured for her to follow him. He led her to the back of the store, to a small, cluttered room that served as his office and living quarters. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, the air thick with the scent of old paper and tobacco. He walked over to a dusty shelf, where the music box sat, nestled among a collection of old books and trinkets. He picked it up carefully, his hands trembling slightly. The box was made of dark, polished wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. It was a beautiful object, a testament to a time of elegance and refinement, a stark contrast to the harsh realities of their frontier life. Your mother loved this music box, Silas said, his voice soft, filled with a bittersweet nostalgia. She brought it with her from the East, when she came to marry me. It was a reminder of her home, of a life she had left behind. He opened the box, revealing a velvet-lined interior. The familiar melody, a delicate waltz, began to play, its tinkling notes filling the small room. Mercy felt a pang of emotion, a wave of memories washing over her. She remembered sitting on her mother's lap, listening to the music, feeling safe and loved. There's a secret compartment, Silas said, his voice barely audible above the music. He pressed a hidden button on the side of the box, and a small drawer slid open, revealing a folded piece of paper. Mercy gasped. It was another piece of the map, identical in style to the one Jesse had shown her. This piece, however, seemed to depict a different section of the landscape, a different set of symbols. I hid it here after Jesse's father was killed, Silas said, his voice heavy with regret. I knew Thorn would be looking for it. I couldn't let him get his hands on it. Jesse, who had been watching silently, stepped forward. He took the piece of paper from Silas, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He compared it to the piece he had, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle. It's starting to make sense, he said, his voice filled with a growing sense of anticipation. The two pieces together, they show a trail, a path leading into the Superstition Mountains. The Superstition Mountains, a rugged, unforgiving range of peaks and canyons that loomed over Redemption, their dark silhouette a constant reminder of the wildness that lay just beyond the town's borders. They were a place of legend, of mystery, of danger. The Lost Dutchman's mine is said to be hidden somewhere in those mountains, Jesse said, his voice low. But it's a treacherous place. Many men have gone searching for it, and few have ever returned. Mercy felt a shiver of apprehension. She knew the stories, the tales of prospectors who had vanished without a trace, of men driven mad by the heat and the isolation, of the Apaches who guarded the mountains jealously, protecting their sacred lands from intruders. Thorne will be expecting us to go there, Silas said, his voice grim.
He knows we have the map.
He'll be watching the trails, waiting for us. We need a plan, Mercy said, her voice firm. She was determined to help Jesse, to protect her father, to unravel the secrets of the past. She was no longer the naive girl Jesse had left behind. She was a woman of the frontier, strong and resilient, capable of facing whatever dangers lay ahead. We'll need supplies, Jesse said. Food, water, ammunition. And horses. Good ones. I can provide the supplies, Mercy said. The store has everything we need. And I know the mountains, Silas said. I know the hidden trails, the secret canyons. I can guide you. Jesse looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and gratitude. I appreciate that, old man. I know this isn't easy for you. Silas nodded, his expression resolute. It's time to finish what we started, he said. It's time to put an end to Thorne's reign of terror. As they began to make their preparations, gathering supplies and discussing their strategy, a sense of purpose filled the small room. The whispers in the wind seemed to carry a message of hope, of determination, of a shared destiny that had brought them together, bound by the secrets of the past and the promise of a future yet to be written. The storm had passed, and for the first time since his return, she felt a sense of direction forming out of the chaos. Chapter 6. A bargain struck in the dark. The back room of the general store became a hive of activity. Mercy moved with a practiced efficiency, gathering supplies from the shelves, sacks of flour, beans, coffee, dried meat, and jerky. She filled canteens with water, checked the levels of kerosene in the lamps, and packed extra blankets and medical supplies. Her movements were precise, her focus unwavering, but beneath the surface, her mind raced. She was preparing for a journey into the unknown, a journey fraught with danger, a journey that could very well end in death. Jesse, meanwhile, was inspecting the weapons. He checked the rifles, cleaning and oiling them with a practiced hand. He loaded the revolvers, his movements swift and economical. He was a man transformed, his earlier casual demeanor replaced by a steely determination, a focus that bordered on predatory. He was an outlaw, a man accustomed to violence, to living on the edge. And yet, Mercy saw a different side of him, a vulnerability that he tried to hide, a flicker of fear in his eyes that mirrored her own. Silas, despite his age and infirmity, was surprisingly helpful. He knew the store's inventory like the back of his hand, directing Mercy to hidden caches of supplies, to items she had forgotten they even had. He also insisted on packing a small, worn leather-bound book, a journal filled with his own handwritten notes and sketches of the Superstition Mountains. This might come in handy, he said, his voice gruff. It contains information about the trails, the water sources, the hidden canyons. Things that aren't on any map. As they worked, the conversation was sparse, punctuated by long silences. The weight of their situation, the gravity of the task ahead, hung heavy in the air. They were three unlikely allies, bound together by a shared past, by a common enemy, by a desperate hope for survival. Once the supplies were gathered, Mercy led them to the small stable behind the store, where she kept her horses. She had two sturdy, reliable mounts, a chestnut mare named Belle and a black gelding named Shadow. They were well trained, accustomed to the harsh terrain, and loyal to a fault. "We'll need 2 more, Jesse said, looking at the horses with an appraising eye. "And they'll need to be fast. Thorne's men will be riding the best." Mercy nodded. "There's a rancher, Old Man McGregor, a few miles outside of town. He breeds some of the finest horses in the territory. But he's a stubborn old cuss. He won't sell them easily." "I can handle him," Jesse said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I have a way with stubborn old cusses." They left Silas at the store, promising to return before dawn. The night was cool and clear, the stars a brilliant tapestry overhead. The moon, a sliver in the sky, cast long, eerie shadows as they rode out of town, the silence broken only by the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves. McGregor's ranch was a sprawling affair, nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. The ranch house was a modest, but well-maintained structure, built of adobe and surrounded by a sturdy corral. As they approached, a pack of dogs began to bark, their fierce warnings echoing through the stillness of the night. Jesse dismounted, handing the reins of his horse to Mercy.
"Stay here," he said.
"I'll go talk to him." Mercy watched as he approached the house, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't draw his weapons, but his hand rested on the butt of his revolver, ready for any trouble. A light flickered in the window of the ranch house, and a moment later, the door opened. McGregor stood in the doorway, a shotgun in his hands, his face a mask of suspicion. He was a tall, gaunt man, his face weathered by years of sun and wind, his eyes as sharp and cold as a hawk's. Mercy couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw the 2 men talking, their voices low and tense. She saw McGregor's initial hostility gradually give way to a grudging respect, then to a flicker of something that might have been amusement. After what seemed like an eternity, Jesse returned, a grin on his face. He was leading 2 magnificent horses, a powerful roan stallion and a sleek, gray mare. "He agreed to sell them," Jesse said, his voice filled with satisfaction.
"But it cost me."
"How much?" Mercy asked, her curiosity piqued. "Not money," Jesse said, his eyes twinkling. "A bargain. A promise." "What kind of promise?" Mercy pressed, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Jesse hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. "I promised him that I would return the map to him, once we're finished with it." Mercy felt a surge of anger. "You what?"
she exclaimed.
"You promised him the map? The map that belongs to my father, to us?" "It's the only way he would agree to sell us the horses," Jesse said, his voice calm. "And we need those horses, Mercy. We need every advantage we can get." "But it's not yours to give," she protested, her voice rising. "It's a means to an end," Jesse said, his eyes unwavering. "We need to get to the mine to stop Thorne. Once we've done that, we can worry about the map." He was right, of course. She knew that. But the thought of giving up the map, of betraying her father's trust, filled her with a sense of dread. She looked at the horses, at their powerful muscles, their intelligent eyes. She knew they were essential to their survival. "All right," she said, her voice resigned. "But I'm holding you to that promise, Jesse. You get us to the mine and you get us back safely. And then the map goes back to McGregor." A bargain had been struck, a pact made in the darkness under the vast, uncaring sky. The price of survival, it seemed, was higher than she had anticipated. As they headed back toward town, a sense of profound unease settled over. Chapter 7. The Price of Freedom. The ride back to redemption was silent and tense. Mercy wrestled with the bargain Jesse had struck, the implications of giving up the map weighing heavily on her mind. She understood the necessity, the desperate need for the horses, but the thought of betraying her father's trust, of losing a piece of her mother's legacy, gnawed at her conscience. As they approached the town, the first faint streaks of dawn were beginning to paint the eastern sky, a pale wash of color against the darkness. The air was still and cool, carrying the scent of dew-covered sage and the distant murmur of the waking town. They found Silas asleep in a chair in the back room of the store, the journal still clutched in his hands. He woke with a start as they entered, his eyes blinking in the dim light. "You're back," he said, his voice hoarse. "Did you get the horses?" We did, Jesse said, his voice devoid of any triumph. He avoided Mercy's gaze. But it came at a price. Silas looked from Jesse to Mercy, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. What price? Mercy hesitated, unable to meet her father's gaze. It was Jesse who spoke, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. I promised McGregor the map, he said, in exchange for the horses. Silas's face turned ashen. He stared at Jesse, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. You what? He stammered, his voice trembling. You promised him the map? My map? The map I risked my life to protect? It was the only way. Old man, Jesse said, his voice firm.
We need those horses to survive.
We need every advantage we can get against Thorn. But it's not yours to give, Silas protested, his voice rising in anger. It's a piece of my past, a piece of my family's history. I know that, Jesse said, his voice softening slightly. But right now, our priority is to stay alive. We can worry about the map later. Later? Silas scoffed. There may not be a later, thanks to you. Mercy stepped forward, placing a hand on her father's arm.
Pa, she said softly. Jesse's right.
We need to focus on surviving. We can deal with the map situation once we're safe. Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and disappointment. He had trusted Jesse, had welcomed him back into their lives, had shared his secrets with him. And now, he felt betrayed, his trust shattered. I don't know what to say, he said, his voice barely a whisper. There's nothing to say, Jesse said, his voice cold. We made a deal. We're sticking to it. He turned and walked away, heading towards the stable to prepare the horses. Mercy watched him go, her heart aching for her father, for the rift that had formed between them. She knew that Jesse had made the right decision, the only decision he could have made under the circumstances. But she also knew that it had come at a terrible cost. Pa, she said, turning back to her father.
I'm sorry.
I know this is hard, but we'll get through this. We'll get the map back. I promise. Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a weary resignation. He had aged years in the last few hours, the lines of his face etched deeper, his shoulders stooped with the weight of his burden. I hope you're right, Mercy, he said, his voice barely audible. I truly hope you're right. They finished their preparations in silence, the tension thick and heavy between them. As they mounted their horses, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the town. The air was filled with the sounds of morning activity, the clatter of wagons, the shouts of children, the distant barking of dogs. But for Mercy, Silas, and Jesse, the world seemed muted, distant, as if they were already separated from the everyday life of redemption, already on a path that led to an uncertain future. The price of freedom, it seemed, was the loss of trust, the shattering of bonds, the heavy weight of a promise made in the dark. As they rode out of town, heading towards the looming shadows of the Superstition Mountains, Mercy felt a sense of foreboding, a premonition of the dangers that lay ahead. She wondered if they would ever truly be free of the past, if they would ever be able to reclaim what they had lost. The weight of the choices settled on her shoulders. Chapter 8. Echoes of Betrayal. The journey into the Superstition Mountains was arduous and unforgiving. The terrain was rugged, a chaotic jumble of towering peaks, deep canyons, and treacherous washes. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the rocks and turning the air into a shimmering haze. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead, the rustle of a lizard darting across the sun-baked earth, and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves. Mercy rode beside Silas, trying to offer him comfort and reassurance, but he remained withdrawn, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, his face a mask of sorrow and resentment. He barely spoke, answering her questions with monosyllabic grunts, his silence a constant reminder of the rift that had formed between them. Jesse rode ahead, scouting the trail, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of danger. He was a man in his element, his movements fluid and graceful, his senses honed by years of living on the edge. He seemed to anticipate every obstacle, every potential threat, guiding them through the treacherous landscape with an almost uncanny skill. As they rode deeper into the mountains, the landscape became even more desolate, more forbidding. The vegetation thinned, replaced by towering cacti, twisted junipers, and jagged rock formations. The air grew cooler, the shadows deeper, the sense of isolation more profound. They stopped for a brief rest in a narrow canyon, a sliver of shade carved into the towering rock walls. A small spring trickled from the rocks, forming a tiny pool of clear, cool water. They refilled their canteens, watered the horses, and ate a meager meal of dried meat and hardtack. "We should reach the first landmark by nightfall," Jessie said, consulting Silas's journal. "A place called Weaver's Needle. It's a distinctive rock formation, shaped like a well, like a needle." Silas nodded, his eyes still fixed on the journal. He traced the lines of the map with his finger, his expression a mixture of familiarity and dread. "It's a dangerous place," he said, his voice low. "Sacred ground to the Apaches. They don't take kindly to intruders." "We'll be careful," Jessie said, his voice reassuring. "We'll avoid any contact with them if we can." Mercy looked at Jessie, her eyes questioning. She knew that avoiding the Apaches was easier said than done. They were masters of the mountains, their knowledge of the terrain unmatched, their skills as warriors legendary. As they continued their journey, Mercy couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, scanning the rocky slopes, the shadowed canyons, expecting to see a figure emerge from the rocks, an arrow nocked and aimed at their hearts. The feeling intensified as the day wore on, the shadows lengthening, the air growing colder. The silence of the mountains seemed to press in on her, amplifying her fears, her doubts, her regrets. She thought about the bargain Jessie had made, the price he had paid for their survival. She understood his reasoning, his desperation, but she couldn't forgive him for betraying her father's trust. She knew that the map was more than just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of her family's history, a link to her mother, a legacy that had been entrusted to her father. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape, they reached Weaver's Needle. It was a towering spire of rock, its sharp peak piercing the sky, a breathtaking and awe-inspiring sight. But Mercy felt no sense of wonder, only a growing sense of dread. They made camp in a small, sheltered alcove at the base of the needle, a natural fortress that offered some protection from the elements and from prying eyes. Jessie built a small fire, its flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the rock walls, illuminating their faces, their weary expressions, their unspoken fears. As they sat around the fire, eating their meager supper, the silence between them grew heavier, more strained. The echoes of betrayal, of mistrust, of resentment, hung in the air, a palpable presence that separated them, even as they huddled together for warmth. Mercy looked at her father, his face etched with sadness and disappointment. She looked at Jessie, his eyes guarded, his expression unreadable. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, a sense of isolation, even in the company of these two men who had once been so close, who had once shared a bond of brotherhood. She knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, dangerous, and that the price of freedom might be more than they could bear. The betrayal lingered, a bitter taste that overshadowed even the growing danger that surrounded them. And they were all running out of time. Chapter 9. Beneath a Starless Sky. The night was cold and unforgiving, the wind whistling through the narrow canyon, carrying with it the chilling whispers of the desert. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint, flickering glow that barely illuminated their faces. Sleep eluded Mercy. She lay wrapped in her blankets, staring up at the sky, but the stars offered no comfort, their distant light obscured by a thick layer of clouds. It was a starless sky, a reflection of the darkness that had settled over their small group. She could hear Silas tossing and turning, his restless movements a testament to his troubled mind. She knew he was still grappling with Jessie's decision, with the betrayal that had shattered his trust. She wished she could comfort him, could find the words to ease his pain, but she felt helpless, trapped in a web of her own doubts and regrets. Jesse was sitting by the dying embers of the fire, his back to them, his figure silhouetted against the faint glow. He was staring into the darkness, his posture tense, his senses alert. He seemed to be listening to the night, to the whispers of the wind, to the subtle sounds of the desert. Mercy got up and walked over to him, her footsteps muffled by the soft sand. She stood beside him, her presence a silent question. He didn't turn to look at her, his gaze fixed on the darkness. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. "No," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Too much on my mind." He nodded, his silence an acknowledgement of her unspoken concerns. "I know you're angry with me," he said, his voice flat. "About the map." "It's not just the map, Jesse," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's the trust. You broke my father's trust. You broke my trust." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of the embers. There was a sadness in them, a depth of regret that she had never seen before. "I did what I had to do, Mercy," he said, his voice earnest. "I had to protect you, both of you. I couldn't let Thorn get his hands on you." "I know," she said, her voice softening. "But there has to be another way. There has to be a way to get the map back, to make things right." He sighed, running a hand through his hair.
"I don't know, Mercy.
"I honestly don't know. Thorn is a dangerous man. He's ruthless, cunning, and he won't stop until he gets what he wants. We can't give up," she said, her voice firm. "We have to fight. We have to find a way to outsmart him." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the determination in her gaze, the strength that belied her gentle appearance. He saw the woman she had become, the woman who had survived hardship and loss, the woman who was willing to fight for what she believed in. "You've changed, Mercy," he said, his voice soft. "You're not the same girl I left behind." "I had to change," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "Life and redemption, it doesn't leave you much choice." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. It was a tender gesture, a fleeting moment of connection that sent a shiver through her. It was a reminder of the past, of the love they had once shared, of the bond that had been broken but not entirely erased. "I'm sorry, Mercy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything. For leaving you, for hurting you, for putting you in danger." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. She felt the warmth of his hand, the calloused roughness of his skin, the familiar scent of leather and gunpowder that clung to him. It was a bittersweet sensation, a mixture of pleasure and pain, of longing and regret. "I know you are," she said, her voice trembling. "But apologies won't change anything. We need to focus on what's ahead. We need to survive this." He nodded, his hand dropping from her cheek. He turned back to the darkness, his posture once again tense, his senses alert. "We'll get through this, Mercy," he said, his voice firm. "I promise you. We'll get through this together." His words were a reassurance, a vow, a glimmer of hope in the starless night. But Mercy knew that promises were easily broken, that trust was a fragile thing, that the path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. As she returned to her blankets, she clung to the memory of his touch, to the faint hope that they could somehow overcome the obstacles that lay before them, that they could find a way to reclaim their future, to escape the shadows of the past. But a nagging feeling of dread remained in the pit of her stomach, and she knew their trials were far from over. Chapter 10. The Heart's Reckoning. The next day's journey was even more challenging than the previous one. The trail grew steeper, more treacherous, winding its way through narrow canyons and across rocky ridges. The sun beat down mercilessly, the air shimmering with heat. The horses struggled, their hooves slipping on the loose rocks, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Mercy felt the strain as well, her muscles aching, her throat parched, her head pounding from the relentless sun. But she pushed on, driven by a stubborn determination, by a refusal to give in to the pain, to the fear, to the doubt. Silas, despite his age and infirmity, was surprisingly resilient. He rode with a grim determination, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, his face set in a mask of stoic endurance. He seemed to draw strength from the mountains, from the familiar landscape, from the memories of his past. Jesse, as always, was the leader, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his senses alert for any sign of danger. He seemed to anticipate every obstacle, every potential threat, guiding them through the treacherous terrain with an almost uncanny skill. As they rode, Mercy found herself watching Jesse, studying his movements, his expressions, his interactions with her father. She was trying to understand him, to reconcile the outlaw she had known 10 years ago with the man he had become. She saw the hardness in him, the ruthlessness that came from a life lived on the edge. But she also saw a vulnerability, a flicker of compassion, a hint of the boy she had once loved. She remembered the night before, the brief moment of connection they had shared, the touch of his hand on her cheek, the apology he had offered. It had been a fleeting moment, a glimpse of the man beneath the hardened exterior. But it had been enough to stir something within her, a flicker of hope, a rekindling of the feelings she had tried so hard to bury. She knew that she shouldn't trust him, that he had betrayed her, that he had put them all in danger. But she couldn't deny the attraction she felt for him, the undeniable pull that drew her to him, despite everything. As the day wore on, they reached a narrow pass, a treacherous defile between two towering rock walls. The trail was barely wide enough for a single horse, the ground littered with loose rocks and scree. "This is it," Silas said, his voice low. "The entrance to the Devil's Gulch. The mine is hidden somewhere in there. The Devil's Gulch." The name itself sent a shiver down Mercy's spine. It was a place of legend, a place of darkness, a place where many men had met their deaths. Jesse stopped, his eyes scanning the narrow passage. He dismounted, handing the reins of his horse to Mercy. "I'll go ahead," he said. "Scout the trail. Make sure it's clear." "Be careful," Mercy said, her voice filled with concern. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. There was a silent understanding between them, a recognition of the danger they faced, a shared determination to survive. He disappeared into the narrow passage, his figure swallowed by the shadows. Mercy waited, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She could hear the sound of his boots on the rocks, the occasional dislodged stone tumbling down the slope. The silence stretched on, agonizingly slow. Mercy strained her ears, listening for any sign of trouble, any indication that Jesse was in danger. Suddenly, a shout echoed through the canyon, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Mercy's heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed her rifle, her hands trembling. "Stay here," Silas said, his voice firm. He dismounted, his own rifle in hand. "I'll go help him." "No, pas," Mercy protested. "It's too dangerous." "I can handle myself," Silas said, his eyes determined. "I've faced worse than this in my day." He disappeared into the passage, leaving Mercy alone with the horses, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and dread. She waited, listening to the sounds of the battle, the shouts, the gunfire, the screams. It was a cacophony of violence, a terrifying reminder of the stakes they were playing for. The sounds of battle continued for what seemed like an eternity, then gradually faded, replaced by an ominous silence. Mercy waited, her breath held, her body tense. She didn't know what had happened, who had survived, who had fallen. Finally, she saw a figure emerge from the passage, silhouetted against the bright sunlight. It was Jesse, his clothes torn, his face covered in dust and blood. He was limping slightly, but he was alive. Mercy's heart surged with relief. She ran to him, her arms wrapping around him in a fierce embrace. She didn't care about the blood, the dirt, the danger. She was just grateful that he was alive. He held on, and the two just breathed in the moment. He pulled back slightly, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of surprise in them, a hint of something else, something deeper, something that sent a shiver through her. "He didn't say anything." "Silas?" she asked. He pointed to the gulch, and her father emerged. He too was alive. The heart's reckoning had begun. The battle had been fought, but the war was far from over. The mine and Thorn still awaited. They all knew there was no going back. Chapter 11. Scars of the Past. Jesse and Silas were both injured, but thankfully, not seriously. Jesse had a grazed shoulder from a bullet and a bruised leg from a fall. Silas had a nasty gash on his arm from a knife fight with one of Thorne's men. Mercy, using the supplies she had packed, cleaned and bandaged their wounds, her touch gentle and efficient. There were 3 of them, Jesse said, his voice grim. Lying in wait. They must have followed us from Redemption. Thorne is getting desperate, Silas said, his face pale. He knows we're close. We need to be more careful, Mercy said, her voice filled with concern. We can't afford any more mistakes. They rested for a while, allowing Jesse and Silas to recover from their injuries. The encounter had shaken them all, a stark reminder of the dangers they faced, of the ruthlessness of their enemy. As they sat in the shade of the canyon walls, Mercy noticed Jesse staring at her, his eyes intense, his expression unreadable. She felt a blush creep up her cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. What? She asked, her voice self-conscious. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice low. You were brave back there, he said. Running to me like that. You could have been killed. I couldn't just stand there, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I had to make sure you were all right. He nodded, his eyes softening. I know, he said. And I appreciate it. He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. It was a brief gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her, a reminder of the connection they shared, a connection that had survived years of separation and betrayal. Silas, who had been watching them, cleared his throat. We should get moving, he said, his voice gruff. We don't want to be caught here in the open. They packed up their supplies and continued their journey, moving deeper into the Devil's Gulch. The terrain was even more treacherous now, the trail narrow and winding, the canyon walls towering above them, casting long, dark shadows. As they rode, Mercy found herself thinking about Jesse's words, about the bravery he had attributed to her. She had never thought of herself as brave, but she realized that she had changed, that she had grown stronger, more resilient, more capable of facing danger. She had also changed in other ways. She had begun to see Jesse in a different light, to see beyond the outlaw, the betrayer, the man who had broken her heart. She had begun to see the vulnerability beneath his hardened exterior, the flicker of compassion, the hint of the boy she had once loved. She knew that she shouldn't trust him, that he was still a dangerous man, that he had put them all in danger. But she couldn't deny the feelings she had for him, the undeniable pull that drew her to him, despite everything. As the sun began to set, they reached a small, hidden cave, a natural shelter that offered some protection from the elements and from prying eyes. They decided to make camp there for the night. Jesse built a small fire, its flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the cave walls, illuminating their faces, their weary expressions, their unspoken fears. As they sat around the fire, eating their meager supper, Silas pulled out his journal, the leather-bound book that contained his notes and sketches of the Superstition Mountains. He opened the journal to a page that contained a detailed drawing of a section of the Devil's Gulch. He pointed to a specific location on the drawing, a small, almost imperceptible mark. This is it, he said, his voice low. The entrance to the mine. It's hidden behind a waterfall, a natural camouflage that makes it almost impossible to find. Mercy looked at the drawing, her eyes widening. She had never imagined that the mine would be so cleverly concealed, so well protected. We're close, Jesse said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Very close. But as they prepared for the night, a shared sense of dread settled in. They all bore scars, visible and invisible, and the ghosts of their past were all around them. The mine and the final confrontation loomed. Chapter 12. The Devil's Stew. The air inside the cave grew heavy with a palpable tension, a suffocating silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional sigh or restless movement. Sleep was a distant, unattainable luxury. Every rustle of wind, every snap of a twig, every distant howl of a coyote sent shivers of apprehension down their spines. They were close to the mine, close to Thorn, close to a confrontation that could very well be their last. Mercy lay awake, wrapped in her blankets, staring at the dancing shadows on the cave walls. She could feel Jesse's presence nearby, his silent vigilance a constant reminder of the danger they faced. She wondered if he was sleeping, if he was haunted by the same fears, the same doubts, the same regrets that plagued her. She thought about the journey they had taken, the hardships they had endured, the betrayals they had suffered. She thought about her father, his broken trust, his shattered dreams. She thought about Jesse, the outlaw she had once loved, the man who had returned to her life, bringing with him a storm of danger and uncertainty. She knew that she should hate him, that she should resent him for putting them all in this perilous situation. But she couldn't. She had seen the vulnerability beneath his hardened exterior, the flicker of compassion, the hint of the boy she had once loved. She had felt the connection between them, the undeniable pull that drew her to him, despite everything. She got up and walked over to the mouth of the cave, drawn by the cool night air, by the need to escape the suffocating tension inside. She stood there, looking out at the vast expanse of the desert, at the towering peaks of the Superstition Mountains, silhouetted against the starlit sky. Jesse joined her, his presence a silent comfort. He didn't say anything, just stood beside her, sharing the silence, sharing the moment. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Even in its harshness, its unforgiving nature, there's a beauty to it." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the landscape. "It's a land of contrasts," he said, his voice low. "Of beauty and danger, of life and death, of hope and despair. Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The life you chose? The choices you made?" He hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice filled with a hint of sadness. "Sometimes," he said, "but regrets are a luxury I can't afford. I have to focus on the present, on surviving, on making things right." "Can things ever be made right?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. He turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know," he said, "but I have to try. I owe it to you, to your father, to myself." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. It was a tender gesture, a fleeting moment of connection that sent a shiver through her. It was a reminder of the past, of the love they had once shared, of the bond that had been broken but not entirely erased. She held his gaze, and the two shared a moment. A sudden noise shattered the silence, the sound of rocks dislodging, of footsteps approaching. Jesse's hand dropped from her cheek, his body tensing, his senses instantly alert. "Someone's coming," he whispered, his voice urgent. He grabbed his rifle, his movements swift and silent. He motioned for Mercy to stay back, to hide behind the rocks. Silas, awakened by the noise, joined them, his own rifle in hand. His face was pale, but his eyes were determined. They waited, their hearts pounding, their breath held, their bodies tense. The footsteps grew closer, closer, until a figure emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. It was Thorn. He was a tall, imposing figure, his face scarred and weathered, his eyes cold and cruel. He was dressed in black, a pistol in each hand, his posture radiating menace. He was flanked by two of his men, equally menacing, equally armed. Well, Thorn said, his voice a low growl. "Look what we have here. The prodigal son returns, with his little band of misfits." Jesse stepped forward, his rifle aimed at Thorn's chest. "It's over, Thorn," he said, his voice cold. "Give it up." Thorn laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the canyon. "Give it up?" he sneered. "I don't think so, Boone. I've come too far, waited too long. I'm not giving up until I have what's mine." "The mine isn't yours," Jesse said, his voice unwavering. "It belongs to no one. It belongs to whoever has the map," Thorn retorted. "And I intend to have that map, one way or another." He raised his pistols, aiming them at Jesse and Silas. His men did the same, their weapons trained on Mercy, who was still hidden behind the rocks. "This is your last chance, Boone," Thorn said, his voice deadly.
Hand over the map, or die.
The devil's due had come. The moment of truth had arrived. There was no escape, no turning back. The confrontation was inevitable, a clash of wills, a battle for survival, a reckoning for the sins of the past. The echoes of betrayal, now replaced by the cold, hard reality of the present. The lives of all concerned hung on a knife's edge. Chapter 13. A glimmer of hope. The standoff hung in the air, thick with tension, heavy with the threat of violence. The only sound was the whistling of the wind through the canyon, a mournful cry that seemed to echo the desperation of the situation. Mercy, hidden behind the rocks, watched in terror, her heart pounding, her breath held, her body trembling. Jesse stood his ground, his rifle aimed at Thorn's chest, his eyes cold and unwavering. Silas stood beside him, his own rifle ready, his face a mask of grim determination. "I'm not giving you the map, Thorn," Jesse said, his voice steady. "You'll have to kill me to get it." Thorn smiled, a cruel, chilling expression that sent shivers down Mercy's spine. "That can be arranged," he said, his voice a low growl. He raised his pistols, his finger tightening on the trigger. His men did the same, their weapons trained on Jesse and Silas. Just as Thorn was about to fire, Mercy acted. She stepped out from behind the rocks, her hands raised, her voice clear and strong.
"Stop," she cried.
"Don't do it." Thorn hesitated, his eyes shifting to Mercy, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. His men lowered their weapons slightly, their focus momentarily diverted. "Stay out of this, girl," Thorn said, his voice menacing. "This is between me and Boone." "No, it's not," Mercy said, her voice unwavering. "It's about the map, about the mine, about a past that you've twisted and corrupted for your own greed." She walked towards Thorn, her hands still raised, her eyes fixed on his. She was unarmed, vulnerable, but she was also determined, driven by a desperate hope to prevent bloodshed, to find a way out of this deadly impasse. "The mine doesn't belong to you, Thorn," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It belongs to the land, to the mountains, to the people who came before us." Thorn laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You're a fool, girl," he said. "You don't understand the power of gold, the allure of riches. It can buy you anything, everything. It can't buy you happiness," Mercy said, her voice firm. "It can't buy you peace. It can't buy you redemption." Her words seemed to strike a chord, a flicker of something unreadable crossing Thorn's face. He lowered his pistol slightly, his gaze shifting from Mercy to Jesse, to Silas. "What do you propose, girl?" he asked, his voice still menacing, but with a hint of curiosity. "I propose a trade," Mercy said, her voice gaining strength. "The map for our lives. We'll give you the map, and you'll let us go. No more bloodshed, no more violence." Thorn considered her offer, his eyes narrowed, his mind calculating. He looked at his men, their faces expectant, their weapons still at the ready. "And what's to stop me from taking the map and killing you anyway?" he asked, his voice cynical. "My word," Mercy said, her voice unwavering. "And the word of Jesse Boone. We give you our word that we won't interfere with your plans, that we'll leave this place and never return." Jesse, who had been watching silently, stepped forward. "She's right, Thorn," he said. "We'll give you the map. Just let us go." Thorn looked at Jesse, his eyes filled with suspicion. He knew that Jesse was a dangerous man, a man who was capable of anything. But he also knew that Jesse had a code, a sense of honor, however twisted it might be. "All right," Thorn said, his voice grudging. "I accept your offer. Hand over the map." Mercy looked at Silas, her eyes pleading. He hesitated for a moment, his face torn between his desire for revenge and his love for his daughter. He finally nodded, his expression resigned. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the two pieces of the map, the fragments of the past that had brought them to this perilous moment. He handed them to Mercy, his hand trembling. Mercy walked towards Thorn, her heart pounding, her steps measured. She held out the map, her eyes fixed on his. Thorn snatched the map from her hand, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He examined the two pieces, fitting them together, his face breaking into a wide, greedy smile. "It's real," he said, his voice filled with awe. "The lost Dutchman's mine. It's real." He looked at Jessie and Silas, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and satisfaction.
"You fools," he said.
"You could have had it all. But you chose to side with a girl, with a sentimental old man." He gestured to the mine entrance and began to move away, his eyes darting around the gulch. He turned to his men. "Let's go," he said. "We have a mine to find." He and his men disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps echoing through the canyon. Mercy, Jessie, and Silas were left alone, standing in the silence, the weight of their decision hanging heavy in the air. They had survived, but at what cost? A glimmer of hope had appeared, but the future remained uncertain, their path shrouded in doubt. Chapter 14. Crossroads of Fate. The silence that followed Thorn's departure was profound, a stark contrast to the tension and violence that had preceded it. It was a silence filled with relief, with regret, with uncertainty. They had survived, but they had also lost. They had given up the map, the key to the lost Dutchman's mine, the legacy of their past. Mercy looked at her father, his face etched with sadness and disappointment. He had lost more than just a map. He had lost a dream, a connection to his past, a piece of his soul. "I'm sorry, Pa," she said, her voice filled with remorse. "I had to do it. I had to save our lives." Silas nodded, his expression resigned. "I know, child," he said, his voice weary. "You did what you had to do." He looked at Jessie, his eyes filled with a mixture of resentment and grudging respect. "You too, Boone," he said. "You kept your word. You could have killed him, taken the map back. But you didn't." Jessie met Silas's gaze, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't about the map anymore," he said. "It was about keeping a promise, about doing what was right." He turned to Mercy, his eyes searching hers. There was a question in them, a silent plea for understanding, for forgiveness. "We need to go," he said, his voice low. "We need to get out of here before Thorn changes his mind." They gathered their belongings, their movements slow and deliberate. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, drained by the ordeal they had endured. As they prepared to leave, Mercy noticed something on the ground, near where Thorn had been standing. It was a small, folded piece of paper, torn and crumpled. She picked it up, her heart pounding. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was a fragment of the map, a small piece that had apparently ripped off when Thorn had snatched it from her hand. It was a tiny piece, almost insignificant, but it contained a crucial detail, a symbol that she recognized from her father's journal. "Look at this," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. She showed the fragment to Silas and Jessie. Silas examined it closely, his eyes widening. It's the marker," he said, his voice filled with awe. "The marker that indicates the exact location of the mine entrance. It's not behind the waterfall, it's beneath it." Jessie's eyes lit up.
"Thorn doesn't know," he said.
"He thinks the entrance is behind the waterfall. He'll waste time searching there." While he looked at Mercy, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of hope, a flicker of excitement. "We still have a chance," Mercy said, her voice firm. "We can still find the mine before Thorn does." Silas nodded, his expression determined. "But we have to be careful," he said. "Thorn is a dangerous man. He won't give up easily." They were at a crossroads, a turning point in their journey. They could choose to leave, to walk away from the mine, from the danger, from the past. Or they could choose to fight, to reclaim what they had lost, to face Thorn one last time. The decision was not easy. They were exhausted, injured, outnumbered. But they also had a secret, a piece of the puzzle that Thorn didn't have. They had a chance, a slim chance, but a chance nonetheless. Mercy looked at Jessie, at her father, their faces illuminated by the faint light of the rising sun. She saw the determination in their eyes, the refusal to give up, the flicker of hope that had been rekindled. "We're not giving up," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We're going to find that mine." Their fate was uncertain, their path fraught with danger. But they were together, united by a shared purpose, by a common enemy, by a glimmer of hope that refused to be extinguished. They had reached a crossroads, and they had chosen their path. They would face the future, whatever it may hold, together. They would not surrender. Chapter 15. The Unforgiving Land. The decision made, a renewed sense of purpose, albeit tinged with trepidation, filled them. They knew the risks, the dangers that lay ahead, but the thought of letting Thorn claim the mine, of allowing his greed to triumph, was unbearable. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to give up now. They carefully concealed their horses in a nearby crevice, knowing that they would need to proceed on foot, stealthily, to avoid detection. The terrain around the waterfall was rugged and treacherous, a maze of boulders, canyons, and hidden crevices. Silas, guided by the fragment of the map and his own intimate knowledge of the area, led the way. He moved with a surprising agility for his age, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, his senses alert for any sign of Thorn and his men. Jesse followed close behind, his rifle ready, his eyes sweeping the landscape, his body tense and alert. He was a predator, his senses honed by years of living on the edge, his instincts finely tuned to danger. Mercy brought up the rear, her own rifle clutched in her hands, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She was not a fighter, not an outlaw, but she was a woman of the frontier, strong and resilient, capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. They moved slowly, cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the soft sand and the roar of the waterfall. The air was thick with moisture, the spray from the cascading water creating a perpetual mist that clung to their clothes and skin. As they approached the waterfall, they could hear the voices of Thorn's men, their shouts and curses echoing through the canyon. They were searching behind the waterfall, just as Jesse had predicted, their efforts frustrated and futile. Silas motioned for them to stay hidden, to wait for the opportune moment. They crouched behind a cluster of boulders, their bodies tense, their breath held, their eyes fixed on the waterfall. They watched as Thorn's men searched frantically, their movements increasingly desperate. They were tearing apart the rocks, digging in the sand, their frustration growing with each passing moment. Thorn himself was pacing back and forth, his face a mask of anger and impatience. He was shouting orders, cursing his men, his voice filled with a venomous rage. "Find it, you fools!" he roared. "It has to be here." After what seemed like an eternity, Thorn's men emerged from behind the waterfall, their faces dejected, their clothes soaked, their hands empty. "We can't find it, boss," one of them said, his voice trembling. "It's not here." Thorn's face turned purple with rage. He slammed his fist against a rock, his knuckles bleeding. "It has to be here," he screamed. Boone wouldn't have given up the map unless it was here. He turned and looked around, his eyes narrowed, his gaze sweeping the canyon. He was suspicious, his instincts telling him that something was wrong. Mercy, Jesse, and Silas remained hidden, their bodies pressed against the cold rock, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that if Thorn spotted them, they would be trapped, outnumbered, and outgunned. Suddenly, Thorn's gaze fell upon the pool of water beneath the waterfall, the seemingly placid surface reflecting the sky above. He stared at it for a moment, his mind working, his eyes gleaming with a sudden realization. "Beneath," he shouted. "It's beneath the waterfall, not behind it." He turned to his men, his face breaking into a cruel smile. "Get in there, you fools," he ordered. "They find that entrance." Mercy, Jesse, and Silas knew that they had to act quickly. Thorn had figured it out, and it was only a matter of time before his men found the entrance to the mine. They had to get there first. The Unforgiving Land had presented them with a challenge, a race against time, a desperate gamble for survival and redemption. The mine, and their fate, awaited them beneath the churning waters. It was now or never. Chapter 16. Blood and Redemption. Silas, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and a lifetime of pent-up frustration, was the first to move. He plunged into the churning pool beneath the waterfall, the icy water shocking his system. But he didn't hesitate. He knew the exact spot, the hidden crevice beneath the surface, the secret entrance to the lost Dutchman's mine. Jesse followed close behind, his rifle held above his head, his movements swift and powerful. He was a force of nature, his body accustomed to hardship, his mind focused on the task at hand. Mercy, despite her fear, followed them into the water, her rifle clutched tightly in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold water numbed her limbs, but she pushed on, driven by a fierce determination, by a refusal to let Thorn win. The water was deeper than she expected, the current strong and turbulent, pulling at her clothes, threatening to drag her under. She struggled against the force of the water, her lungs burning, her muscles aching. She saw Silas disappear beneath the surface, followed by Jesse. She took a deep breath and plunged into the darkness, the roar of the waterfall deafening in her ears. She felt her way along the rocky bottom, her hands searching for the crevice, for the hidden entrance. She found it, a narrow opening beneath a submerged ledge, just as Silas had described. She squeezed through the opening, her body scraping against the rough rock, her lungs screaming for air. She emerged into a dark, narrow tunnel, the air thick with moisture, the silence profound. She saw Silas and Jesse ahead of her, their silhouettes outlined by the faint light filtering through the entrance. They were moving quickly, silently, deeper into the tunnel. She followed them, her footsteps echoing through the narrow passage. The tunnel sloped downward, gradually descending into the depths of the earth. As they moved deeper into the mine, the air grew colder, the darkness more complete. Jesse lit a small lantern, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls, illuminating their faces, their determined expressions, their unspoken fears. They reached a large chamber, the heart of the mine. The walls glittered with veins of gold, reflecting the lantern light, creating a breathtaking spectacle. It was a sight that would have filled them with awe, with wonder, under different circumstances. But now, it only filled them with dread. They knew that Thorn and his men would be right behind them, that the final confrontation was inevitable. As if on cue, they heard the sounds of pursuit, the splashing of water, the shouts of men, echoing through the tunnel. Thorn had found the entrance. Jesse extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. "Get ready," he whispered, his voice tense. "They're coming." They positioned themselves behind a cluster of rocks, their rifles ready, their hearts pounding. They waited, their senses alert, their bodies tense. The first of Thorn's men appeared, their lanterns casting a flickering glow that illuminated the chamber. They were wet and shivering, but their eyes were filled with greed, with the lust for gold. Thorn followed close behind, his face a mask of fury, his pistols drawn. "Find them," he roared. "Kill them all." The battle began. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing through the chamber, the air filling with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Mercy fired her rifle, her aim steady, her hand surprisingly calm. She saw one of Thorn's men fall, his body crumpling to the ground. Jesse and Silas were fighting fiercely, their movements precise and deadly. They were outnumbered, but they were also determined, fighting for their lives, for their freedom, for redemption. The chamber became a scene of chaos, of violence, of desperate struggle. Men screamed, bullets whizzed, rocks shattered. The air was filled with the sounds of battle, the cries of the wounded, the moans of the dying. Mercy saw Jesse take a bullet to the arm, his body staggering, but he continued to fight, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. She saw Silas, his face covered in blood, wrestling with one of Thorn's men, their bodies locked in a desperate struggle. She saw Thorn, his eyes wild, his face contorted with rage, firing his pistols indiscriminately, his bullets striking the walls, the rocks, the bodies of his own men. The battle raged on, a brutal, bloody conflict that seemed to have no end. The mine, once a place of dreams, of hope, had become a tomb, a scene of death and destruction. Mercy fought with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, her fear replaced by a cold, hard determination. She was fighting for her life, for her father's life, for Jesse's life. She was fighting for redemption, for a chance to escape the shadows of the past, for a future free from violence and greed. It was a gruesome battle. Blood and redemption were earned in the deep darkness. Chapter 17. The Ghosts We Carry. The gunfight in the mine was a brutal, chaotic dance of death. The confined space amplified the sounds of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the grunts of exertion. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, blood, and sweat. Mercy fought with a desperate courage, her movements fueled by adrenaline and a fierce will to survive. She saw Jesse, despite his wounded arm, take down another of Thorne's men with a well-aimed shot. His face was grim, his eyes focused, his movements precise and deadly. He was a man transformed, a warrior fighting for his life, for his future, for a chance at redemption. Silas, despite his age, was holding his own, his years of experience giving him an edge in the close-quarters combat. He fought with a ferocity born of desperation, of a lifetime of regrets, of a burning desire to protect his daughter. Mercy herself managed to take down another of Thorne's men, her shot finding its mark with surprising accuracy. She felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name, a mixture of fear, exhilaration, and a grim satisfaction. The battle seemed to go on forever, a blur of movement, noise, and violence. But gradually, inevitably, the tide began to turn. Thorne's men, disoriented by the darkness, hampered by their greed, and demoralized by their losses, began to fall one by one. Finally, only Thorne remained, his back against the wall, his pistols empty, his face a mask of fury and despair. He was cornered, defeated, his dreams of riches turned to dust. Jesse, his rifle aimed at Thorne's chest, stood before him, his face grim, his eyes cold. Silas stood beside him, his own rifle ready, his face etched with a mixture of weariness and triumph. Mercy stood a little behind them, her rifle lowered, her body trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of the adrenaline surge. She had survived, they had all survived, but the cost had been high. "It's over, Thorne," Jesse said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Drop your weapons." Thorne looked at Jesse, at Silas, at Mercy, his eyes filled with hatred and defiance. He knew he was beaten, but he refused to surrender. "You may have won this battle, Boone," he spat, his voice raspy. "But you'll never have the mine. You'll never have peace. The ghosts of your past will haunt you forever." He raised his hand, revealing a small, concealed knife, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, final act of defiance. Before Jesse or Silas could react, Thorne lunged at Jesse, the knife aimed at his heart. Mercy screamed, her voice echoing through the chamber. Jesse, with a swift, instinctive movement, sidestepped the attack, the knife grazing his side. He fired his rifle, the shot hitting Thorne square in the chest. Thorne staggered backward, his eyes widening in disbelief, his body slumping to the ground. He was dead. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of Jesse, Silas, and Mercy. The battle was over. The mine was theirs, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the violence, by the loss, by the ghosts of the past. Jesse knelt beside Thorne's body, his face a mask of weariness and regret. He closed Thorne's eyes, a gesture of respect for a fallen enemy. Silas lowered his rifle, his body slumping with exhaustion. He looked at Mercy, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Mercy walked over to Jesse, her hand reaching out to touch his shoulder. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain that went beyond his physical wounds. "It's over," she said softly, her voice trembling. "We're safe now." He nodded, his head dropping, his shoulders shaking slightly. He was grieving, not for Thorne, but for the violence, for the loss, for the ghosts that they all carried, the ghosts of the past that would continue to haunt them, even in victory. They were all changed. They could not go back to the life they had known. The mine and the battle within it had changed them forever. The ghosts would always be with them. Chapter 18. A Promise Renewed. The immediate aftermath of the battle was a blur of activity. They tended to their wounds, Jesse's arm and side, Silas's cuts and bruises. Mercy, her hands surprisingly steady despite the lingering tremor of adrenaline, cleaned and bandaged their injuries, her touch gentle and efficient. They searched Thorne's body and those of his men, finding nothing of value except their weapons and a few meager supplies. The gold, the riches of the lost Dutchman's mine, remained hidden, a secret that the earth still guarded jealously. They left the bodies where they lay, a grim reminder of the violence, of the cost of greed, of the fragility of life. They had no time for burials, no energy for mourning. They needed to escape the mine, to return to the world above, to find a way to heal, to rebuild their lives. As they made their way back through the tunnel, towards the hidden entrance, the weight of their experience settled upon them, a heavy burden of grief, regret, and uncertainty. They had survived, but they had also lost. They had lost their innocence, their illusions, their sense of security. They emerged from the mine, blinking in the bright sunlight, the roar of the waterfall a welcome sound after the oppressive silence of the underground chamber. They were free, but they were also changed, scarred by the violence they had witnessed, by the choices they had made. They retrieved their horses, their loyal companions who had waited patiently for their return. They mounted, their bodies aching, their spirits weary, their minds filled with the memories of the battle, of the ghosts they carried. As they rode away from the Devil's Gulch, away from the lost Dutchman's mine, away from the scene of death and destruction, they didn't speak. There were no words to express the emotions that churned within them, the complex mixture of relief, grief, regret, and a fragile, tentative hope. They reached redemption as the sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dusty streets. The town seemed quiet, peaceful, almost surreal after the violence they had endured. They returned to the Hollister General Store, their sanctuary, their home, the place where their journey had begun. Silas, his face etched with weariness, went inside, seeking the comfort of his familiar surroundings. Mercy and Jesse remained outside, standing beside their horses, their silence heavy with unspoken emotions. Jesse looked at Mercy, his eyes searching hers. He saw the sadness in them, the pain, the exhaustion. But he also saw something else, a strength, a resilience, a flicker of hope. "I'm sorry, Mercy," he said, his voice low, filled with regret. "For everything. For putting you and your father in danger, for the choices I made, for the pain I caused." She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I know," she said, her voice soft. "But it's over now. We survived." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. It was a gesture of comfort, of connection, of a shared experience that had bound them together, despite the betrayals, despite the pain. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice firm. "I'm leaving," he said. "I'm going to find McGregor, return the horses, and then I'm moving on." Mercy felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss, despite everything that had happened. She had known this was coming, that he couldn't stay, that he was an outlaw, a man who belonged to the wild, to the open road. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He shrugged, his eyes looking towards the horizon.
"I don't know," he said.
"Somewhere, anywhere where I can start over, where I can find peace." He paused, then looked back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and a flicker of something else, something that made her heart skip a beat. "I made a promise," he said, his voice low. "A promise to McGregor about the map. But I made another promise, a promise to myself, a promise to you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was the fragment of the map, the piece that Mercy had found, the piece that had given them a chance to find the mine. He handed it to her, his hand trembling slightly.
"This is yours," he said.
"Your father's, your family's. I'm not keeping it. I'm not giving it to McGregor. I'm giving it back to you." Mercy took the fragment, her eyes widening in disbelief. She had thought he would keep his promise to McGregor, that he would honor the bargain he had made.
But why?
She asked, her voice filled with confusion. He smiled, a sad, bittersweet smile. Because some promises are more important than others, he said. Because some things are worth more than gold, more than riches, more than a life on the run. He leaned in, his lips gently brushing against her forehead. It was a tender gesture, a fleeting moment of connection, a promise renewed. He mounted his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at her one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness, regret, and a fragile, tentative hope. "Goodbye, Mercy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He turned his horse and rode away, disappearing into the gathering darkness, leaving Mercy standing alone, clutching the fragment of the map, her heart filled with a complex mixture of emotions. The promise had been renewed, but the future remained uncertain, their paths diverging once again. The outlaw had ridden away, but the memory of him, of the journey they had shared, would linger, a ghost that she would carry with her, always. Chapter 19. Facing the Storm. Mercy watched Jesse disappear into the twilight, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the distance. A profound sense of loneliness washed over her, a feeling of emptiness that echoed the vast, unforgiving landscape surrounding her. She clutched the fragment of the map, its rough edges digging into her palm, a tangible reminder of the journey they had shared, of the promises made and broken, of the love that had flickered and faded like a desert mirage. She turned and walked back into the general store, the familiar scent of the place, a mixture of dust, wood smoke, and spices, offering a small measure of comfort. Silas was sitting in his usual chair, his head in his hands, his body slumped with exhaustion. He looked up as she entered, his eyes red-rimmed, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. "He's gone?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Mercy nodded, unable to speak, the lump in her throat preventing her from uttering a word. Silas sighed, a deep, shuddering sound that seemed to express a lifetime of regrets, of losses, of unspoken emotions. "I knew he would," he said, his voice barely a whisper.
"He's a wild one, that Jesse."
"Always has been, always will be." He looked at Mercy, his eyes searching hers. He saw the sadness in them, the pain, the unspoken longing. "You loved him, didn't you?" he asked, his voice gentle. Mercy hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her tears finally spilling over, running down her cheeks. "I did," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I still do." Silas reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch offering a silent comfort, a connection that transcended words. "I know, child," he said. "I know." They sat in silence for a long time, sharing their grief, their loss, their unspoken emotions. The store, their sanctuary, their home, seemed to enfold them in its embrace, offering a small measure of solace, a refuge from the storm that had raged through their lives. As the days turned into weeks, Mercy tried to return to her normal routine, to the familiar rhythms of life and redemption. She restocked the shelves, served customers, tended to her father, trying to find comfort in the mundane, in the everyday tasks that had once defined her existence. But the memories of Jesse, of the journey they had shared, of the lost Dutchman's mine, lingered, a constant presence that haunted her waking hours and invaded her dreams. She found herself constantly looking towards the horizon, expecting to see him ride back into town, his silhouette against the setting sun, his eyes filled with that familiar mixture of danger and tenderness. She knew it was a foolish hope, a futile longing. He was gone, and he wasn't coming back. He was an outlaw, a man who belonged to the wild, to the open road. He had made his choice, and she had to accept it. But accepting it was not easy. Her heart ached with a pain that seemed to have no end, a wound that refused to heal. She felt lost, adrift, uncertain of her future, of her place in the world. One evening, as she was closing the store, a storm began to brew, the sky turning a dark, ominous purple, the wind whipping through the streets, carrying with it the scent of dust and rain. It was a familiar scene, A reminder of the day Jessie had returned, of the storm that had brought him back into her life, and now, of this new, very similar tempest. As she secured the shutters, she saw a figure approaching, silhouetted against the swirling dust, a lone rider on a powerful horse. Her heart skipped a beat, a flicker of hope, of disbelief, surging through her. Could it be? Could he have returned? The rider drew closer, the sound of his horse's hooves muffled by the wind. He was a tall figure, lean and hard, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. As he dismounted, in front of the general store, Mercy's hope turned to ashes. It was not Jessie. It was a stranger, a man she had never seen before. He was dressed in the clothes of a working cowboy. He looked at her, he tipped his hat and forced a smile. Mercy was, for the first time since she had seen Jessie ride away, was once again facing a new storm. One she could not have imagined. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The stranger's eyes, though weathered by the sun and wind, held a kindness that immediately put Mercy slightly more at ease, though the apprehension of his sudden arrival still lingered. He was tall, but not as imposing as Jessie, his build more wiry than muscular. His clothes, though dusty, were well kept, suggesting a man of some means, or at least, one who took pride in his appearance. "Evenin'," he said, his voice a soft drawl, a contrast to Jessie's gravelly tones. "Name's Caleb McAllister. I'm lookin' for a Miss Mercy Hollister." Mercy's heart pounded. Why would a stranger be looking for her? Had Thorne had allies? Was this some new threat, some delayed consequence of their journey to the mine? "I'm Mercy Hollister," she said, her voice cautious, her hand instinctively moving towards the rifle she kept behind the counter. Caleb nodded, his eyes taking in the store, her guarded posture, the rifle within her reach. He didn't seem surprised or threatened. "I was told I might find you here," he said. "By a man named McGregor. He said you might be able to help me." McGregor, the rancher who had sold them the horses, the man to whom Jessie had promised the map. A wave of relief washed over Mercy, followed by a renewed sense of confusion. "Help you with what?" she asked, her voice still wary. Caleb reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it, revealing a folded piece of paper. It was a map, or rather, another fragment of a map. Mercy's eyes widened in disbelief. Another piece of the lost Dutchman's mine map? How was this possible? "McGregor said you might know something about this," Caleb said, holding out the map. "He said a man named Jesse Boone gave it to him a long time ago. Said it was part of a larger map. A map to a lost gold mine." Mercy took the map fragment, her hands trembling. It was identical in style to the other pieces, the same intricate lines, the same cryptic symbols. But this piece depicted a different section of the landscape, a different set of clues. "Where did McGregor get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb shrugged. "He didn't say," he replied. "Just said that Boone had given it to him, years ago, as collateral for a loan. A loan that Boone never repaid." He paused, then looked at Mercy, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and a hint of something else, something that made her heart skip a beat. "McGregor said that Boone told him the map was cursed," he continued, "that it brought nothing but trouble, that it was better off forgotten. But McGregor never forgot. He held on to it, hoping that one day someone would come along who could make sense of it." He looked at Mercy, his gaze intense. "McGregor said you were that someone," he said. "He said you knew Boone, that you knew about the mine, that you might be able to help me find it." Mercy felt a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, disbelief, a flicker of hope, and a deep, aching sadness. Jessie had known about this other piece of the map all along. He had given it to McGregor, years ago, before he had even met her. He had kept it a secret, another layer of deception, another piece of the puzzle that she was only now discovering.
But why?
Why had he kept it from her? Why had he given it to McGregor? Why hadn't he used it himself? She looked at Caleb, at his expectant gaze, at the map fragment in her hand. She realized that she was at another crossroads, another turning point in her life. She could choose to walk away, to leave the map, the mine, the past behind her. She could choose to focus on her life in redemption, on her father, on the familiar routines that offered a semblance of peace, of security. Or she could choose to embrace the unknown, to follow the trail of the map, to seek answers to the questions that haunted her, to confront the ghosts of her past one last time. She looked at Caleb, at his honest, open face, at his eyes that held a spark of adventure, of a shared dream. She saw a reflection of herself in him, a yearning for something more, for a life beyond the confines of redemption, for a chance to discover the truth, to find her own redemption. "I can help you," she said, her voice firm, her decision made. "I know about the map. I know about the mine. And I know where to find the other pieces." She reached into the drawer behind the counter and pulled out the 2 fragments of the map that she possessed, the pieces that Jessie had given back to her. She laid them out on the counter, alongside Caleb's piece, the 3 fragments forming a larger, more complete picture. Caleb's eyes widened in amazement. "It's real," he said, his voice filled with awe. "The lost Dutchman's mine. It's real." He looked at Mercy, his gaze filled with gratitude and a growing sense of excitement. "We can do this," he said. "Together. We can find the mine." Mercy nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of trepidation and a renewed sense of purpose. She was embarking on another journey, another adventure, another confrontation with the past. But this time, she was not alone. She had a partner, a companion, a man who shared her dream, her yearning for something more. The final confrontation was not with an enemy, with a villain, but with herself, with her past, with the choices she had made, with the love she had lost and found again, in a different form, in a different way. The horizon stretched before her, vast and unknown, filled with both danger and promise. She was ready to face them, to embrace the future, whatever it may hold. This time, she would not look back. Epilogue. The journey to the lost Dutchman's mine with Caleb was different than the one with Jessie and Silas. There was no looming threat of a vengeful outlaw, no constant fear for their lives. Instead, there was a shared sense of purpose, a quiet camaraderie, and a growing respect between Mercy and Caleb. Caleb was a steady, reliable presence, his calm demeanor a soothing balm to Mercy's still healing wounds. He was a skilled tracker and outdoorsman, but he lacked Jessie's dangerous edge, his reckless impulsiveness. He was, in many ways, Jessie's opposite, and yet Mercy found herself drawn to him, to his kindness, his honesty, his quiet strength. They followed the map, the 3 fragments now pieced together, revealing a trail that led them deep into the Superstition Mountains, to a location different from the one where they had confronted Thorn. This was a new path, a new adventure, a new beginning. They found the mine, not hidden behind or beneath a waterfall, but nestled within a secluded canyon, its entrance cleverly concealed by a rock slide, a natural camouflage that had protected it for decades. The mine was not filled with glittering gold, as they had imagined. Instead, it was a place of quiet beauty, of geological wonders, of shimmering crystals and ancient rock formations. There was some gold, enough to make them comfortable, enough to secure their future, but it was not the vast treasure that had fueled the legends, the greed, the violence. Mercy realized that the true treasure was not the gold, but the journey itself, the companionship she had found with Caleb, the healing she had experienced, the rediscovery of her own strength, her own resilience. They spent several weeks exploring the mine, carefully documenting their findings, mapping its passages, marveling at its hidden wonders. They worked together, their skills complementing each other, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Mercy found herself talking to Caleb about Jessie, about the past, about the pain and the love she had experienced. He listened patiently, offering comfort and understanding, without judgment, without jealousy. "He was a part of your life," Caleb said one evening, as they sat by their campfire, the stars a brilliant tapestry overhead. "A significant part." You can't erase that and you shouldn't try. But you can learn from it, grow from it, move forward. Mercy nodded, her heart filled with gratitude for his wisdom, for his acceptance, for his unwavering support. They eventually left the mine, leaving it undisturbed, its secrets protected, its beauty preserved. They returned to redemption, not as outlaws or fugitives, but as partners, as friends, as something more. They used the gold they had found to improve the store, to help her father, to invest in the town, to create a better future for themselves and for the community. Silas, his health failing, finally found peace, his regrets fading, his heart filled with a quiet pride in his daughter, in the woman she had become. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by love, his hand clasped in Mercy's. Mercy and Caleb eventually married, their love a quiet, steady flame, a beacon of hope and happiness in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory. They built a life together, a life filled with purpose, with companionship, with a deep, abiding love that had grown from the ashes of the past. The Lost Dutchman's mine remained a legend, a mystery, a symbol of the enduring allure of the American West. But for Mercy, it was more than just a legend. It was a reminder of the journey she had taken, of the ghosts she had faced, of the love she had lost and found again, of the redemption she had earned. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can still flourish, that even in the most unforgiving of landscapes, love can still bloom. The map, now whole, served as a decoration and reminder of all she had overcome.